Hello and welcome to or back to my library. We just did my best books of 2025 and now it's time to get into the worst books. So if you want the tea, stick around. Honestly, this was kind of a challenging list to make because I really didn't have that many bad books. I would normally consider like an actual bad book to be 2 stars or less, but I only had 2 of those and there's got to be a video. So these are all of the books that I rated 2.5 stars or less. I think I had 12 in total, but I knocked off 2 of them to make it an even 10, but also because I didn't think those last 2 books really deserved to be on a worst book of the year list. So we'll start with number 10, which was Thirst by Marina Yuszczuk. And this is not a bad book per se, but it was just really boring and disappointing. Quite possibly my favorite genre of book is gothic sapphic vampire books, which is exactly what this book was, and yet it was so boring. It had a really cool setting. There was stuff to do with like mausoleums in this book. It had the atmosphere. It had the beginnings of a really interesting plot. Mainly the backstory of the vampire was excellent. So it started off really promising and then just went nowhere. It was so boring and I kept reading it hoping that it was going to get more interesting and then it just never did. So sadly this one was a flop for me. Number 9 was All Hallows by Christopher Golden. I read a different book by this author years ago and it's still to this day one of the scariest books that I've ever read. So I know this author can write really good horror, and yet this one was so underwhelmingly not scary. It takes place in a small town on Halloween night in the 1980s where this terrifying pumpkin creature is using the ghost of children that it's killed to hunt down different families throughout the city. There's a really cool Halloween maze and a creepy forest and all of the elements that should work so well for a horror book, and yet it did not. Mainly because while all that stuff was present, the vast majority of this book was just centered on family drama. It was mostly like husbands being called out for cheating and people getting into fights with their parents and just all these things that I did not care about, and all of that was at least 80% of this book. The actual horror elements were very few and far between, and by the time the horror elements actually kicked in, I was no longer interested in the book, but it was really short so I still finished it. I probably should have DNF'd it, but I was hoping that it would get better and it sadly did not. The 8th worst book of the year was Our Winter Monster by Dennis A. Mahoney. This one is a winter themed horror novel. It's about a couple who's in a car accident in the middle of a blizzard, and while trying to find help in this small town nearby, they end up being stalked by this monstrous thing. And again, cool setup, had really good promise, and then it just went absolutely nowhere. I honestly couldn't even tell you what the point of this book was because it wasn't scary. There was really no message to it. It just didn't feel like it was trying to say anything aside from attempting to be scary but then failing at that. There was definitely promise to it, but that promise was not lived up to, unfortunately. Number 6 is Realm of Ash by Tasha Suri, which is the sequel to Empire of Sands. I loved that first book so much. It was fantastic. It was fast-paced and romantic and really tense and just so beautifully written. I have no idea what happened in book 2, but it was not the same series. I had no idea what was going on for any of this book. It did not make a lick of sense to me. It took me far too long to even realize that we weren't following the same character as book 1, but it was actually the sister of the main character from the first book. I didn't put that together until quite a bit into it, and then once I realized that, things still weren't making sense, and I went back and I reread passages. I went and read a recap of book 1, just trying to figure things out. I slowed down the audiobook. I had the ebook with me as well so I could follow along. I put an effort to understanding this book, and it did not make sense. This felt like it was part of the same series, but it felt like I skipped a book. This felt like it should have been book 3 in the series, but I somehow skipped book 2. I actually had to go and double check and make sure that I didn't do that by accident, and no, this is in fact only a duology, so I definitely didn't skip a book, but it felt like I did. The plot made no sense and just didn't really seem to connect at all with book 1, and I didn't understand any of it really. But the writing was pretty and I liked the main character, so at least there was that. Number 5 was The Lolo Wood by Carmen Machado. This is a graphic novel that I actually read twice, or mostly read twice. The first time that I tried it, I DNF'd it after about 50% of it or so because it just was not making any sense to me. I love the art style, but I had no idea what was going on in the plot. But a couple of months later, I was still thinking about it and I wanted to go back and see if I could reread it in a better frame of mind maybe and see if it made more sense to me. So I read it again and it still made no sense. Again, the art was beautiful and I did like the characters, but other than that, I had no idea what was going on for the plot. Not for a lack of trying, I promise I was paying attention to it, but it just seemed very meandering with like horror and gore just for the sake of having it in there. But yeah, no idea what happened in this book, even though I tried very hard to understand it. Number 4 is Born of Blood and Magic by MC Hutson, which I got an arc of, and I always feel bad giving a low rating to an arc, but this was so bad. Oh my god. It started off so well. I was so into it for the first maybe 40% of it, and then it went swiftly downhill from there. But I kept reading it because I was just hoping I would get some of that joy back, and it just never came. I liked the characters, but the plot was really bland and meandering. The dialogue was super awkward, and the romance was so lackluster for me as well. I was already kind of having a hard time with the romance. This one is a sapphic vampire story that's set in Toronto, which are all things that I should love, and I was so hyped to have this kind of story set in my city, but the romance was so off-putting to me. It's a vampire and a vampire hunter, which I do like that dynamic, but in the prologue, the vampire killed the main character's mother. And that becomes a romance afterward? Like, what? Absolutely not. And that's not a spoiler, it's in the synopsis of the book, but I clearly just didn't process that before I started it, because I probably wouldn't have taken the arc had I realized that's what it was about, because I just really can't get behind that kind of romance. Like, how do you fall in love with someone who killed your mother? So that was my bad, but the rest of my points about the book still stand about, you know, the plot being bland and the dialogue being awkward. All those things still stand, and yeah, I wanted to like this book so much, but sadly did not. I read a few paranormal romances around the Halloween season, and sadly one of them is the third worst book of the year, which was Pumpkin Spice and Poltergeist by Elle K. Mulford and K.L. Morrison. This had elements of things that I enjoyed. It follows our main character who's being haunted by the ghost of her girlfriend who passed away, and she's trying to get her to move on and go on dates with other people, and then she meets the new girl in town and things go from there. Very fun setup. I liked the romance portion of it, but unfortunately the main plot of it was so incredibly stupid. There was a whole like murder mystery happening in this book, and it was incredibly predictable and honestly just ridiculous that the somewhat cutesy romance really couldn't make up for how dumb this plot was, sadly. And then my second worst book of the year was also a Halloween romance, and that was Spookily Yours by Jennifer Chipman. This was ridiculous. I should have known that it was going to be ridiculous based off of the synopsis, and I definitely did. I was going into it knowing that it was going to be a fun, silly time, but I was hoping for more fun than silly, but sadly it just ended up being pure stupid. The main character in this book is a witch, and she adopts a black cat who becomes her familiar, but turns out the black cat is actually a demon who was cursed into cat form, and the two of them fall in love while he is still a cat. Yeah. And honestly, that's not even the stupidest part of this book. I can't say what it is without spoiling it, but there was a scene towards the end of this book that gave me the ick so massively that I almost DNF'd at 90% of the way through, and I just had to grin and bear it throughout the rest of this book, but it was so bad. And finally, the number 1 worst book of 2025 for me was Homebody by Rupi Kaur, which is a book of poetry that my 21-year-old self would have eaten up, and in fact it did with the other books by this author. I used to love Rupi Kaur so much. I loved Milk and Honey and I loved The Sun and Her Flowers, but I read those books when I was like 19 to 20, before my frontal lobe had developed. When I too was a very dramatic, heartbroken young adult who just constantly thought the world was ending at any minor inconvenience. So this isn't really the book's fault. It was more so just the fact that I have matured a lot since the last time that I read a book by this author, or read this kind of poetry in general. But yeah, this was quite bad. It was very cringy and melodramatic, and just everything about it was so not for me. There were a good handful of poems that I thought were absolutely beautiful. I loved the ones that she wrote about family and like kind of finding your purpose in life, but anything to do with like romance and love and sex and all those things, which was the majority of the book, were extremely cringy to me. But I do really wish that I had read this book when I was much younger and still could have appreciated it, but sadly I did not. But there we have it. There are my top 10 worst books of 2025. If you liked any of these books, nothing personal, we all have different opinions, but if you didn't like any of them as well, let me know down in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts on them as well, and let's just roast some books in the comments. And also let me know what your worst book of the year was. I would love to hear that as well. But that'll do it for this video, so thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a fantastic day wherever you are in the world, and I'll catch you in the next video.